Good morning and afternoon, and welcome to the Quincy Institute's webinar and book talk on Shireen Hunter's The Great Powers and Iran's Social and Political Evolution. My name is Roxanne Farman-Farmayan, and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, a transpartisan think tank in Washington that is working to build a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. In our research and writing and through our advocacy efforts, we're promoting ideas that move the U.S. foreign policy and national security policy away from the global domination and military adventurism and towards a new strategy of diplomatic engagement and the defense of our country based on the interests of the American people, not the corporate and political interests that have fueled American wars for the last 70 years. Today, I am honored to welcome Professor Shireen Hunter, the author of The Great Powers in Iran's Social and Political Evolution. This is her 20th book, and after writing extensively on issues relating to Iran's politics and international relations, the influence of Islam on democracy, development, and foreign policy, significant studies on the post-Soviet rise of the Central Asian states, as well as on the politics of the Persian Gulf neighborhood, Shireen has authored a more personal history this time. It is a fascinating, interwoven narrative that shows how her own life and work has traced every major development and crisis in Iran and its environs, and which offers unusual granular insight on why Iran has become the state it is today, as well as how U.S. policy towards it over the last 47 years has been formulated. It is a book that reveals the frustrations of being both an Iranian and a woman, attempting to provide clear-eyed analysis to a policy world too often blinkered by its own conventions, politics, and fear. Having worked as an Iranian diplomat before serving for over 20 years at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, followed by 12 years at Georgetown University, Shireen brings a unique perspective to the field. Welcome, Shireen, to today's Quincy Institute Book Talk. As so often over the past 45 years, Iran is once again in the news, having just come out of a 12-day war and a serious bombing by the United States. In this wide-ranging mosaic of a book, both personal and scholarly, you set out to capture not only your own life's trajectory, but likewise that of Iran. What are the key lessons that you have been able to draw from writing this book? Although I don't think you've been able to return to Iran, you have personal knowledge of the society there. How have the people you were born to changed as a result of the Islamic Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, and the long enmity with the United States? How have they responded to being isolated from the West economically and politically? In other words, how do we understand what the people inside Iran are feeling about Iran today?
Thank you very much, Roxanne, for moderating this talk. And thank you for the Quincy Institute for hosting this webinar. You are quite right. I only have visited Iran once since the Islamic Revolution. And I had mixed feelings there. That was, of course, 20 some odd years, 25 years ago now. But on the one hand, the changes were absolutely enormous. For example, when I went to visit the Faculty of Law, where I spent 4 years, doing my BA, I couldn't recognize it. The beautiful garden that we used to stroll and dog had been turned into some sort of a prayer place and all that. The way people dress, there was an air of, how shall I say, that everything had kind of gone down. Same thing in the streets. I couldn't recognize any of the streets. The other thing that really for me was very difficult was that everywhere I looked were these great murals of several clerics. Now, I don't personally, I don't have anything against the clerics because, well, they are part of the fabric of Iranian society. But to have them so prominently dominate everything else was a bit difficult. And then there was a little bit the feeling of everything was kind of more run down. At the same time, however, once that, overcoming this initial shock and going to, for example, shops or to bazaars, especially in northern Iran, I realized that in essence, people have not changed that much. It is really Iran. It is the surface that has changed a lot. They were still, now I don't know what has happened in the last 25 years. But one thing that has in my studies also and following Iran has, including the latest episode of the war, has really heartened me is that the resilience of the Iranian culture and Iranian civilization and the ability of Iranian people to do things and create and produce even under very difficult circumstances. So at the end of it, although in many ways what I have seen has saddened me, I also have become heartened. I now truly believe, and maybe I'm naive, but I truly believe that Iran will overcome this difficult period and hopefully will have another renaissance.
Well, that really would be something that we would all hope. And it has a lot to do, I think, with the direction of the government and also the way that the West looks at it. And it's the next question I have. Why is Iran so mysterious to those in the West? Do you perceive it as being a pariah? How do people there view it? What do they think about not having the UN support them, to have so few friends in the region, and this degree of emotionalism, even Orientalism, that has pervaded the Western world, for example? Is this mystery manufactured in the West, or is Iran in fact a feckless and irrational power?
Well, I cannot speak for the Islamic Republic, to be honest with you, because I myself have a significant problem understanding the priorities of the Islamic regime. I am personally, and my family in general, we were not in politics, my immediate family, my collateral family, yes, but not the immediate family. But we were, and even though I was born in Azerbaijan and so on, we were very much of Iranian nationalists. And so for me, I think that the guideline for a constructive foreign policy for Iran should be what is best for Iran, admittedly in an enlightened fashion, not doing something excessive like pursuing aggression or unreasonable things. So for me, I have never been able to understand, and I have said it, including to some people who work for the regime, that I cannot understand, fathom their policy priorities. Why? I mean, the whole ambiguous term of uh, imperial struggle against imperialism. I have told them, why is that you struggle only against Western imperialism, not Russian imperialism or Chinese imperialism? So, in that sense, I cannot understand it. But unfortunately, I think that the problem of West with Iran is very predates the Islamic Republic. I remember that when I served in the Iranian Foreign Service, I could see this. I mean, for example, I'm not saying whether that was a correct policy or not, but when Iran had the festivities for the 2,500 years, the kind of snide remarks that were made about why are they doing this, who are these people to celebrating that. Whereas, I see, even in England, I mean, one could say that Ascot today is a bit of a anachronism in the modern day, particularly when you have also a lot of poverty and difficulties. So every society has, but I think, to be honest with you, I think that part of the problem is that historically, Iran has always been the alternative civilization, the Greek, Persians, and so on. And since the modern Europe was based on the idealization of Greece, that has meant that they had demonized Iran, or Persia as they call it. And in fact, in many ways, this later turned into the Islamic versus Western controversy. But somehow then Europe made its peace with the Turks and Arabs, even though they invaded Iran more recently. But I think there is a basic civilizational thing. And also, I think, to be honest, I mean, that's the only way to be. Part of the problem has been Iran's potential. Now, unfortunately, Iran's potential has never been realized. But it is very interesting that some great powers, certainly Britain, uh, knew. I mean, when I look, for example, in today's nuclear debate, now I oppose Iran having a nuclear weapon because I think doesn't make strategically sense. But it reminds me a little bit that Iran not having any, knowledge of enrichment, a little bit reminds me of the British and Russian opposition to railroads in Iran. I recall a letter by the what is it, Minister Counselor of the Britain, Shield, that in that he admits that he says, well, of course, there's a lot of derogatory things about Iranians. They are treacherous and lazy and all that. But he says that the building of railroad will awaken their latent talents. And also that, for example, they were not, neither Britain nor United States were willing to build a steel works in Iran. And finally, this was done in 1971. The first steel work was done in 1971 with the help of actually of Soviet Union. So I think that there are all these things. Iran has had the potential always to be a viable middle power. And also it is a civilization. It has a very attractive culture. I mean, the Iranian culture spread after the political system in Iran collapsed with the Arab invasion. I mean, before that, there were nobody speaking Persian in India, but later. So I think that there are a mixture. I think the West sees Iran as a potential rival, not just because of this regime. I mean, even the complaints I remember I used to hear during the previous regime. Now, admittedly, there were complaints domestically, but I don't think Iran foreign policy did anything that damages the West. And yet, in some ways, the West turned against the previous government.
Well, and one of the things that you point out is this is a theme all the way through that, in fact, during the second Bush administration, the United States and Western powers went through a huge effort at making sure a pipeline did not go through Iran at enormous cost. And
That's
this,
right.
of course, constrained Iran's ability to become involved in the emerging Central Asian powers. You wrote about this at some length.
That's right. I mean, the problem is that, and it was the United States really did it. I was stationed well, my husband was stationed in Brussels from 1993 to 98 when these things were happening. And I was working at a center there. The Europeans were open. And interestingly, the oil companies were open because the oil companies want the cheapest route to make more money. But it was the United States that prevented, and then the Europeans also had to fall in line. The one major concern of me, because as you can imagine, America is now my second home. And I'm very grateful because they gave me, a place, a refuge. I am married to an American and all that. But I feel very sad that throughout from 1989 onwards, after the ceasefire, if U.S. had responded to some of the overtures that Iran did, um, they would have things in Iran would have changed. To begin with, even in the 1990s, the hardliners had not completely consolidated their power. I mean, that happened much later. I think, starting, and actually the sanctions, all the pressure has actually helped to consolidate the hardliners and has damaged the Iranian people, has damaged the cause of democracy, because people in Iran have been faced with a very bad alternative, either to put up with a regime that I would submit that at least 70% of them, I'm being very conservative, don't like it, or to become like Iraq and Syria and Libya. And because they are a people who
Civil wars.
exactly. So because they are a people who are committed to their country, they have put up with a lot of things. I mean, if you are hungry and worried about what's going to happen, you don't think about certain freedoms and so on. It's when you are more comfortable. I mean, this is everybody knows. All the people who have talked about development and democracy or rebellion say that when people are more comfortable, then they start talking about some things that some people consider luxuries, like, for example, freedom of doing this and freedom of doing that. So it's been very painful because I have consistently written about this, especially, I mean, it started even before the 1980s. And those days I used to get published everywhere in a way. But unfortunately, I think that one thing also happened that changed the whole thing, and that was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Of course. Yeah.
Because one of
Of course, very difficult to present a very dark view of things and then find your worst fears to come into fruition,
absolutely,
especially with
and of course,
warning.
that's right. Unfortunately, Washington is a city that is much better to be wrong and then say, oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong. People who promoted going to war in Iraq and so on, than being right, because people actually resent you for having been right. Well, I was right about Saddam Hussein. I was right about all kinds of things, about Wahhabism and negative impact and so on, about the Taliban. But, the things that but I have to say that it was a logic for that. I think that Americans in particular, Europe really hasn't been much of a player.
No, it hasn't. I think much less than people realize.
Exactly. And I think, unfortunately, the United States chose a way, and of course, partly influence of Israel and all that, to follow a regional policy that, in that context, particularly when you don't have Soviet Union, you needed an enemy to justify all kinds of things. And unfortunately, that enemy became Iran.
Yes.
Because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, China still was not a prominent power. China has become a major power only in the last 5, 6 years. And even now, they are very shy. They don't want to exercise power. I mean, for example, in the Persian Gulf and so on, China basically wants to get as much benefit as it can at as little cost as possible. So I think that but I also have said, unfortunately, nobody listens anymore, is that America has paid the price and the people of the region have paid the price.
Yes.
Like, this Iran obsession contributed greatly, and there are some Afghan friends I have who agree with me. Iran obsession contributed to Pakistan having a free hand to promoting the Taliban, and then everything else. Uh, that happened and bugged down, and now Afghanistan's problem. And of course, Iran is paying the price of America's Afghan problem with having, some people say, close to 7, 8 million Afghans in Iran. I don't have it.
I think we often see that the consequences, especially long term in the region, are completely new and separate from the actual policies that get activated on. And it's a real difficulty between some of the way that American culture and the politics that change leadership every few years versus some of the ways that the Middle East operates. Let me start with also looking at some of the key themes that you explore because I find them very interesting. You begin with Iran versus Islam. You have four themes, and I'm going to try to get to all four. So let's start with that. In a nutshell, please explain what the consequences of this Iran versus Islam tension has been.
Well, to begin with, this Iran, as I mentioned, was a civilization, was a coherent civilization. It was a coherent society with its own cosmology and all kinds of rules and so on. And frankly, a very attractive culture, which was essentially focused on happy events rather than. Islam is also a certain type of civilization. It's a universalist ideas and it's all comprehensive. It's not just a religion, it's also a social and political thing. And as you know yourself, culture, and of course more so ideology, is related to power and also to identity. And I think that from the beginning in Iran, and it goes immediately to the Arab invasion, there was a division between those Iranians that remained loyal to their past, to their language, to their separate identity, and the ones that became completely sort of immersed in Islam and even became hostile to their own culture. I always use the example of the Tahiri dynasty, who even apparently, according to some sources, burned books from the pre-Islamic era because they were so fanatical Muslim. And the Safarid, Yaqub Safar, who, according to some, was refused to listen to a poem in Arabic and asked somebody to write it in Persian. So this sort of Islam Garo, pro-Islam and Iran Garo was there. I think that this became a little bit mitigated when Iran became Shia under the Safavids. And kind of there was a melding, a kind of a modus vivendi between the Shia Islam and Iranianism. And that, I mean, like I will give you a folklore example. For example, in the Zurkhane, the traditional Persian sort of gym, according to today's parliament.
Athletic dance, yes.
Exactly. They used to first start reciting Shahnameh, and then they would talk of praising Ali. So this showed that Iranian nationalism and Shia Islam. Now this divide, although tensions existed, as I mentioned, because my family had all kinds of things. They had very modernist, early modernist, 19th century modernists, like my mother's uncle, and then they also had major clerics, like my grandmother's uncle. And the tension existed even then, between the clerical establishment and the monarchy. But what really broke this, what I call bargain, was the process of modernization. Because to modernize, they had to do certain things. And then that meant that the balance of power in the society changed. I mean, when you secularize they secularized the judicial system, where my great uncle played an important role. Uh, then what happens is that a lot of clerics lose jobs, lose judicial jobs. When you secularize, educational system, they lose jobs because the maktabs in the mosques and so on closes and people go to proper secular. So I think that this changed. So I think a lot of complaints that clerics had about and I'm not suggesting that he was a Democrat at all, about Reza Shah did this and Reza Shah did that. I think if Reza Shah had kept them, occupied or had given them money and so on, their complaints would have been less violent. And of course, and then they turned the people, the so-called what I call the discontents of modernization, turned Islam into an ideology. And Mr. Ali Shariati was a major person. In fact, he himself said our greatest achievement was that we turned um, Islam into an ideology. But my most serious complaint is that in practice, especially the current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, put the interests of this rather nebulous so-called Ummat Islam, which really hasn't responded to him, ahead of the interests of Iranian people and Iranian nation. And that for me is almost unpardonable. Partly also because, partly also because it has been utter failure. No
Yes.
Muslims have responded to this, and I have told them, I said, Iran is a Shia country, and whether rightly or wrongly, many Sunni Muslims, even the ones that may be uh, secular, do not consider them true Muslims. They consider Shiism as a sect. And
Well,
so
it's a difficult balance, isn't it? The nationalism versus the religious tradition, and in fact that moves on to the second theme that I have to bring up that you bring up, the tradition versus modernity, and it's all wrapped together, I think, in terms of where religion, where nationalism, where tradition and modernity have come together.
well, I think that part of the problem was that, when you want to have a certain policy, modernization always is destabilized. Uh, for example, when I did something about Russians, Muslims, and I studied there, one of the biggest opponents of Peter the Great and the sort of his modernizing and westernizing policies were the students that were sent to Europe, Western Europe, by Peter. And this was, and pan-Islamism and all that, and return to the Russian tradition. It was a reaction to that. And in fact, in Europe also, people forget there is, as you mentioned, Roxanne, so rightly, the sense of Orientalism that somehow the people that live, let's say, in Iran or even other parts of the Middle East, were something separate from the rest of the human race, and that they are not really subject to the same rules and things that happen. But in Europe as well, the post-industrial thing, there were all this romantic movement and pastoral movements, the nostalgia to return to, and certain religious, fundamentalist religious movements were also, so this is absolutely a very natural thing. But where it really gets bad is that then, outside powers intervene.
Yeah.
Iran has its own fault lines, as I mentioned,
Mhm.
but so have other countries. Constantly nowadays, they are talking about Iran's ethnic groups. To
Yes.
begin with, in my people, and I have said this to Iranians as well, because some political people in Iran are saying, they make a big mistake. They said they include, for example, Kurds or Lor and even Baluch and so on as non-Iranian. They don't seem to understand there is a difference between Persian and Iranian. It was not a Persian empire. It was an Iranian empire, which included all these things. I always quote this Darius's thing. He said, I am Darius, the king of kings. My father was Vishtas. My clan is, no, my family is Achaemenid. My clan is Persian. My nation is Aryan, which of course has gotten a bad name now, but then it was just a name. So you see, she goes through this kind of thing. But in Iran, they make everybody as a separate thing. Kurdish is a dialect of Persian. It's much closer to the old Persian of Sassanid era and so on. But they make this stuff, a lot of these things. I remember it, my mother used to say, and then the whole idea, Iran's people, Khalkhay Iran, started with the Soviet Union. When in the occupation of Azerbaijan and so on, and in Kurdistan, other places. Now, I'm not saying that there are
During
not
World War II.
Exactly. I'm not saying that there are not ethnic issues, but Europe has ethnic issues. But nobody comes from outside to promote Scottish separatism or Catalan separatism or Occitan separatism in France or whatever. But in Iran, every little people that you know develop a committee or whatever, then you get all the activists from abroad and institutions and so on. So I think Iran has fault lines, but a lot of these fault lines also have been manipulated and created. But to me, the biggest problem has been Iran and Islam, because Islam, unfortunately, has been related to power. And one of the problems of Iran has been, unlike the Sunni powers, in Sunni world, including the Ottoman Empire, the clergy were part of the government. They got their salary from government and so on. So they couldn't challenge the government. During the Safavid times, this was the same thing with the Shias as well. So they couldn't do anything. But because of the turmoil in Iran and recurring internal problems, the clergy developed an independent base of support. And then they created all these ideas of Velayat Faqih and Islamic thing. In the traditional Shia theory, that I mean, you cannot have an Islamic government until the return of the Messiah, the Mahdi. And so, what it is, according to some Shia, even clerics, this is not an Islamic government. It cannot be, and it is not. I don't think that many of the people there are really actually practicing. But anyway, as an Iranian, I do believe, in fact, that matters of conscience are something that has to be uh, with the individual. And I
Well,
think
that certainly seems to be the feeling of many people in Iran, because I think the degree of active worship and active belief has dropped since the Islamic Republic was established. And it's now one of the most or the least religious countries in the Middle East, as far as I know.
absolutely, you are absolutely right. And there has been, in fact, a turning away from Islam and sometimes, going, whereas, because Iranian Islam, the Islam that I grew up with, admittedly, I grew up in a basically modern country, a family that embraced change and modernity and all that. Having said that, it was a gentle and tolerant Islam. And so, it didn't interfere in people's internal life as such. I mean, you wouldn't come and send inspectors to see whether somebody is drinking or is not drinking. And in fact, there are traditions, the Islamic law, that this is not permitted. It's only some extreme Sunni groups that permit that. So the Iranian Islam was very gentle, and so there was not that much of a clash between, Islam and nationalism. Of course, Iran went through a little bit of excessive, I would call, Iranianism, and under
During
the
the Pahlavi era.
the Pahlavi era, and they did some things that was, not necessary. Maybe later it would have been possible to do without any problem. But at that time, this is one of the ironies that at that time a lot of the population was still religious,
Yes.
including, but now, of course, they are not. But I also personally, I have always believed that the Iranian Revolution really was done by the left.
Mhm. How interesting, because it's often thought of as being
No, no,
an aberration to that concept of the leftist moves.
no, no. It was done by the left. If you look at the ideologues of the left, and there is an overlap with the left and some ethnic minorities, including, unfortunately, some of people from the province of Azerbaijan. Bijani Jazani, for example, who was the ideologue of a lot of the groups that Mujahideen Khalq and others, they were all this Mujahideen and others. They all came from the belly of the Tudeh party, when to the party,
Which was the communist linked party.
Communist Party, no, Communist Party and Stalinist Party. And then there were, of course, break within the two day. Then you had the Maoist center and so on. But the problem of my, and I am, sometimes people that have did not grow up during those days don't seem to understand. I mean, I see, for example, there is a lot of romanticism about Mossadegh era.
Could
I
you explain that a little bit for those who might not know of that era?
I am just saying that they think that that time in Iran, the brief period that Dr. Mossadegh was in power, was democracy. That was not democracy. Iran was not prepared for democracy. The Iranian parliament still was elected, and people who voted, maybe they were peasants, but they voted what their patrons told them, what the feudals told them to vote, because they were not educated. Most of them couldn't read or write, and so on. And the other thing that was problem, Iran at that time was in chaos. As a child, I remember every time we went outside, there was some group fighting another group. Mostly the Tudeh party fighting some nationalists, extreme nationalists, and the country was coming to a standstill. And the nationalization of oil was a big mistake of Dr. Mossadegh. I think he had all the good intentions. I remember, and the country was divided. I remember in my own family, my aunt was a devotee of Dr. Mossadegh. Dr. Mossadegh for him was saint and he couldn't do anything wrong. My mother was more skeptical and saying that, my mother was very much of a law and order person. But what I'm trying to say is that another theme in my book is that myths really should not be trusted. I don't care what myth is. In general, after having, I'm old now, and so I have covered a certain period. Um, and so things that I have witnessed myself, and I read the way they are represented in history books, makes me not to trust as much. And so I try to go and fact check, so to speak. And I think a lot of things about Iran history that has been written is very simplistic, very, very simplistic. And also some people have special perspective. I mean, like I personally admire people like Amir Kabir or Moshe Dole and others and so on. But I know some people, just because of one incident, they kind of trash him.
And I think that's quite typical of history and politics and how people, in fact, even make policy. I mean, I think there's a lot of myths. We go back to the current issue about Iran, and there are a great number of myths, I think, that come about that inform the policies towards it.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think there are also certain fundamental things that one could rely on, and that they are basically people refuse to say. One of the things that I think about Iran people have not really realized, despite the discontent and despite of the fault lines that I mentioned in my book, there is a core of because Iranian nation is not just an ethnic nation. Iranian nation is a civilizational nation. And if you really want to say Iranian civilization, I would say that not all of Central Asia, but certainly Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and even parts of Kyrgyzstan, definitely Republic of Azerbaijan, although they deny it, they are civilizationally Iranian.
And the whole area of Kurdistan as well.
Kurds are perhaps the purest remaining of Iranian or Medes. Even
Yeah.
Herodotus talks about the empire of the Medes and the Persians. So
And
this
in
is
fact, you described the Tajiks in Afghanistan again. So it was really a very broad area. And I think that's something that informs current policy making or doesn't in terms of the effect of actions in that area.
No, unfortunately, one of my criticism, which I have written about it, but I also sometimes some more reformist groups, talk to me, not groups, but, young students or people interviewed. And I have told them, I said, if you want influence in Central Asia, you cannot gain influence in Central Asia with Islam because your Islam is alien there. There are almost no Shiites in Central Asia, except, if you consider Hazara and all that. But Iranian culture, they love it. I told them, I said, I listened to some music on the internet. And I see all these comments coming from all kinds of places, especially Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, how much we love you. I said, send Iranian musicians and poets and dancers, which of course now doesn't exist. But that is the strength of the Iranian culture. It is its beauty and actually its joyfulness. Iranian culture is very joyful. When I was growing up, even the morning ceremonies in Muharram were joyful. I mean, we went to watch it as children because it was like going to theater.
Of course,
It
these
was.
are things that emotionally grab
That's
uh,
right. I mean,
viewers.
it's not a drab thing. I mean, if you look at Iranian culture, I mean, the ancient Iranian culture, I'm not saying, I don't want to create another myth. I mean, they had their own flaws and so on. We all are flaws because we are human beings. But when you really look at it, Iran's pre-Islamic culture was all about festivals.
Mhm.
And there was only one thing, and that was mourning for Siavash, who was unjustly, killed. And I saw this Siavash thing where he was killed in Bukhara. So that is the heartland of, in some ways. But I think that the way the one of the other things that I have to say, getting to know any country, it takes a lot of time and effort just by watching a documentary and it requires reading. I always used to say to my students, I said, I'm happy to show you videos and all that, but it's not going to replace reading and what I call elbow grease. You have to put some effort into it. But now this has almost evaporated. And with the internet and YouTube and Iran, a lot of people are expressing opinion or talking about things about which they know very little. And this is also more and more confusing the debates. But the most fundamental problem is that the facts are made to suit the policy rather than the other way around.
So certainly that was the case when you found that the Iranians were shut out of, for example, supporting the Armenians in a negotiated settlement at a time of Azerbaijani
That's right.
Armenian
Yes,
conflict.
that's right. I will tell you that because actually I was there. It was very interesting. I was, by accident, I was in Azerbaijan both in 1990, um, which is still I think it was the Talibov prime ministership was there. Might confuse the names. And they were talking about some elections. And then I was also there in 1992 as the election observer. The whole El Chubay election was a setup, and the Turks, the most extreme of Turkish nationalists, Alvarsalan Turkesh, of the Bozkurds, they were there. They were in front of the El Chubay's office, and they had the military vehicles and all that. And and I remember one occasion when I went, and they controlled already El Chubay's supporters controlled the television and radio. And I remember when I went to a polling station, because I speak the language, and a lady came, a kind of middle-aged, older lady came and opened a handbag and took out about 12 passports, wanted to vote for that. And then the guy said to him that, no, 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 come later. Americans are here. Come later. But I told this to my colleagues. They were not interested because the Americans wanted El to be elected and Turks wanted El to be elected. And so the argument for them that if not, then the Iranians will have influence. There were so many things America did because of, I think, this Iran obsession, which damaged the United States. And I have and then of course they attacked you. If you said something, and unfortunately sometimes the Iranian opposition too. If you said, and during the Iran-Iraq war, I used to say Saddam Hussein is not the better person. And then they, call you apologist or whatever. How can I be when I've lost everything, including a very good career, advancing career? I would have been at least a minor ambassador somewhere in a few years. But the point I'm trying to say that they attacked your integrity as a way of quitting you. And then, of course, as I mentioned it briefly, when Saddam Hussein attacked Kuwait, they said, "Oh, Shireen, you were right." But did they then do anything to compensate me for it? No. In
Or
fact,
take your advice at least.
no, 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 no. In fact, the other people, I remember I had the interview with at ABC with somebody who had been an ardent supporter of Saddam Hussein. And when we came out, I guess I was still quite young. And so I said unguardedly, don't you think, aren't you sorry that you supported Saddam Hussein? He said, no, I was right then and I am right now. So this is the point of thing that I was telling you. It's better to be wrong and then they say, I'm sorry, than to have been right, because then they resent you. They resent you. Uh,
Well, you have described many Western-based analysts and Iran watchers, especially those whose countries of origin have quite hostile relations with their adopted countries. And you've described that as facing difficulties in really understanding and providing balanced perspectives on Iran. Could you dig into that idea a bit? How are their views affected, and why is this leading to things such as double standards or other biases? Prevailing narratives around Iran's politics and
right.
internal social organization that simply, in many ways, mirror images or not true.
No, no, I'm not saying that. What I am trying to say is that uh, people who come from countries like Iran or Afghanistan or I don't know, Palestine or wherever, if you say anything that goes against the uh, conventional wisdom at the time and against the
In the
policy,
adopted country.
that's right, against the policy of the adopted country, you are dismissed.
Mhm.
Always dismiss. I remember, they don't seem to get, I'm not saying that they should accept your perspective, but the idea that to dismiss it and assume that you are saying this because you are prejudiced, because you come from that particular country, I think it's wrong. But it also has another side effect. I mean, my case was different. I was a married woman. I mean, I liked my work and I was doing things, but I was not 100% dependent on what I was earning or whatever. But if you are a young person that has come and you want to have a career and so on. So you had to be very careful. In fact, I remember at a meeting when I was sitting next to somebody from a university, government-related university. He told me, yes, he said that ethnic experts have to be very careful what they say, because otherwise what they say is dismissed. I said, but ethnic experts say certain things because they know certain things better. Whereas
Right,
you tend to see what you want to see. They saw in Saddam Hussein only somebody who was fighting the Ayatollahs and they were angry at the Ayatollahs, so therefore Saddam Hussein must be good. The fact that they couldn't understand that Saddam Hussein could be equally bad.
right.
And also
And I
they
think that's a misunderstanding often about the dividing lines in that region. We haven't had enough time to really explore
are,
Turkey as an element of this, but that too has been something a country that invaded Europe and yet has had a very uncomfortable relationship both with Iran and with the West, and we see this expressed in different ways.
exactly. Well, that's what I'm trying to say, that because Turkey is not a civilizational challenge.
Hmm.
Turkey is not a no matter what you say. If you look, I know people are going to say, oh, yes, you are a racist or whatever, because you said, let's face it. When you look at the Ottoman empires, everything, they had some things. But the Ottoman culture was based on the Seljuk culture. And
Hmm.
the Seljuk culture was an absolute copy, a bad copy of the Sasani things. From politics to everything, Haji Nizamul Mulk, the author of uh, um, politics book, that was his minister of Malik Shah and all that. And in the Ottoman court, they used to speak Persian for quite a while. The Turkish poetry, Turkish is not a language of literature. I'm sorry, I am from a Turkic, not Turkish. Turkic is speaking thing, but and I like the folklore and all that, but Turkish is not a language of poetry or philosophy or anything like that. Um, Arabic, yes, but not the. But you see, another problem of, and let me get back just briefly to the ethnic expert. But what it means that a lot of the young ethnic experts had to walk a very fine line because you have graduated, you have a PhD, you are looking for a job. So what you have to do, you shouldn't be able to rock the boat. So
Hmm.
you have to say things. And so if you look at with few exceptions, if you look at the experts that these days are commenting, including some from Iranian origin, are basically those who are hostile to Iran.
Right.
And I am not saying they are right or wrong, but I'm saying that
To get more play.
that is not a debate. I mean,
Hmm.
it's just that there is no longer debate in United States. Full stop. It wasn't like this in the 80s when I started working, or even 90s, but gradually it has gone, and the last 15 years has become, So in general, everything would have been. One last word I will have to say, which I experienced during my time the very first time I entered the Foreign Service. At first, I worked at the first political department with Mr. Amir Taimur. You might remember his name, Muhammad Reza Amir Taimur. Anyway, he was an interesting man and very well educated and so on. It was dealing with the Arab affairs. And he asked me to start following the Yemen civil war, which was very ironic, and to write a report, and I started writing. At that time, Iraqis were just expelling Iranians, like Iranian woman married to Iraqis, Iranian men married to Iraq. And then I really realized the loneliness of Iran.
Hmm.
And then in my dealings I was assigned to guide the Turkish foreign minister when he was visiting. I had a good time with them because they were all very good and educated. But the things that he was saying, I could see that he thought that Iran was part of the Turkish thing and that probably should come back. And he was a very, very educated and modern man. Actually, his expertise was Persian literature. And I keep telling this. I have told in interviews and other things that you have to be careful. That's why I just can't understand the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic. They keep saying we want to have relations with our neighbors. But for God's sake, most of your neighbors don't like you. I mean,
Hmm.
it was even during the Pahlavi. Every time Iran breathes, they say they are threatening us.
Yes.
I mean, I was there, I was at the at university when the Iraqis were trying to close the Arvan route, Chateau Arab and so on, and the Shah, and nobody said anything. They tried to be conciliatory. Some of these countries don't want Iran to exist.
Mhm.
This is a fact. And all those Iranians that don't understand this, they have something coming. So I am also very, very, um, how shall I say, harsh against certain people who just have thought that, of course, political activism is good if you know what you are doing. But sometimes people who can't do anything else, they become political activists to get money, to get jobs, to get on television, to get attraction, to get Nobel Prize. And I find this the height of unscrupulousness. Now, you don't have to love Iran or you don't have to try to move it in the right direction. And I also think it's not a service to United States. I feel very much committed to United States. I want the US to be prosperous and people happy and all that because I have been living here for almost 47 years. So, I mean, a good part of my life has been in here. But
It's actually one of the things I find comes out very much in your book is the tension and the challenge of feeling a sense of belonging. Because to be an Iranian woman, policy commentator, media personality, it's not been an easy
no,
track. And one of the reasons I think, if I understand correctly from what I gleaned from your evocative book, is that part of that isolation that Iran suffers
I
is translated into those who are abroad as trying to explain, trying to understand the two sides, and it's often very difficult.
very difficult. But it's a very difficult, and it has cost me, even in terms of my own health and everything. But I love Iran, and I'm saying this
And you
unapologetically.
live in the United States as well, and that
I
works
do
both
love
ways.
United States as well. I love the United States that I believe was or can be, and then I have some reservations about some of the policies that U.S. has been following now. But
Also in the past, I mean, it's been
But
consistently.
most important of all, I am committed to my own conscience.
Mhm.
I have always been like that, and this has to do with my upbringing. And I remember my mother because I lost my father when I was 3 months old, and as you have read in my book, um, my grandfather my mother's father was a kind of a peculiar gentleman, and so he did things because he was loyal to his friends, and so he did things that was not very wise in terms of financially and otherwise. Um, and so our circumstances suffered as a result of those things. But my mother always believed that you have to keep your dignity and you have to keep your principles. I
You-
remember,
We're going to have to end there, but
yes,
that's such a great point to end on, that one stays with one's dignity and one's principles. And I
that's
think that helps both as commentators, as foreigners adopting new countries, but also in understanding how the rest of the world imposes and also operates. And I think that's a great note. I can't thank you enough for
oh, I
being here today.
can't thank you enough for having such wonderful questions and doing this. And again, I would like to thank the Quincy Institute and all the people in charge there for organizing it.
Well, and I would like to thank all of you for being with us today and discussing this wonderful book and for participating in this talk. And before I let everyone go, let me mention that our next webinar is going to be on a book called The Most American King, Abdullah of Jordan. And this will be held on Thursday, July 10th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And it will be a conversation with Aaron Majid and Quincy Institute's Anel Shalin, discussing Aaron's new book on the King of Jordan. You can register for that now by going on to our events page at quincy/institute.org/events, and that is QINCYINST hyphen dot org hyphen slash hyphen events. And you can also subscribe to the Quincy mailing list from our homepage, quincyinstitute.org. So you'll receive invitations to all our events and be able to follow our work. Thank you again for participating today and for joining our efforts to promote ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war, as Shireen has so much suggested during this day's conversation, and instead towards military restraint and diplomacy in the pursuit of international peace. Thank you very much.